any attempt to demolish someone who is opposing the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, let's put it that way, separation of church and state. These guys, want the church. They want this to be a Christian nation. Yeah. They do not give a goddamn whether or not what they're doing is unethical, immoral, lies. It doesn't matter, because as far as they're concerned, anything to bring this downfall of this particular candidate. But this has happened before. It happened to Jefferson in 1798 to 1800, when he had to literally, there was a part of our country that were fundamentalists up in Boston. They wanted to take over. That's the ones that started. It was a great book that came out called The Bavarian Illuminati in America, Vernon Stauffer, that really clarified the issue. He went to primary sources and was able to track down where these rumors started. But unfortunately, books are not read in this country anymore. Mostly what we have is speculation on other people's speculations. And it's easy to do that way because, if you want to be an automatic, real quick, highfalutin big seller, all you got to do is be controversial in this country. We're a bit immature in lots of ways, and I'm not trying to bring our country down. It's not it. But the truth is that all you have to do is study a person's bibliography, know where they've got their information, and you have a decent handle, not a total handle, but you have a decent handle as to the quality of mind and research be done, because we all want the truth, and I used to believe what they believed. Back in 68, 67, 68, when I was traveling and spending time with rock and rollers at that time, nobody was not interested in the pyramid and the iron triangle. Every one of them wanted to know what that meant. And, of course, there was not solid information then, because it was until 1978 that the State Department came out with the book that really spelled out its history, that we have solid information. Of course, they had access to all the letters, all the things that you and I couldn't get hold of. And, of course, that may be, to most people, that's who cares about that? But that's when you want to get to the truth, you got to go to primary sources. And it's costly. Yes, indeed. I did not appreciate having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get my education, but you got to. If you really love the truth, and if you really especially want to understand who in the hell these amazing guys were, because to establish a foundation for a republic was not going to be easy, and of course we have not told the whole story in regards to the League of the Iroquois Indians and the Cherokee Indians who influenced our founding fathers. That's the next big thing that's going to come up, because when we get contacts from Hollywood and elsewhere, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for another handle of a so-called something that's brand new. This isn't brand new. It's so old. But they have, again, Hollywood does they make money, and they entertain. That doesn't mean they're factual. And so when we take a look at National Treasure, I love the stories, but if you think they're history, then you've fallen into a ditch there. And they don't even pretend to be. I mean, Dan Brown makes it clear that some of his stuff is right on, but he elaborates a great deal on it, and it makes it far more interesting. And if he didn't, they wouldn't have done his film.
Yeah, that's right. It's another level of this sensationalism, and they're playing on that. And again, unfortunately, people do get programmed by that too, and pick up on that as it is the truth or whatnot. But Robert, before we proceed here and go too deep into it so far, I want to ask you just slightly a little bit here about your background. You obviously have a background in art. You've done some wonderful murals that I've been looking at as well. Some really cool stuff. I've always been enjoying murals, so much context in there to pick up on, obviously. But how long have you been studying symbolism, and specifically the connection with symbolism and the secret origins of America, Robert?
Well, what happened was about in 1963, I had a course in psychology, as we all do in undergraduate school, and the Dr. Carl Moser, he saw my interest in symbols and images and archetypes, and he said to me, "Look, you really want to know this stuff, Bob? Get the book called Dictionary of Symbols by Serlo." And that started a whole different aspect to my life, because the reason why I got involved in American symbolism was being an artist, we were always poor. I mean, you didn't have a phone. Certainly you didn't have a car. You didn't have a TV. You had your studio and you ate. And that was about as much as you could in this country, because the arts weren't appreciated very much. That was really key. So the only way to cool off in my little 150-degree apartment was to sit in the cold water in the bathtub, and that's when I was looking at my last dollar bill and saw this pyramid in the eye and a triangle, and I thought to myself, what the hell is this? This has nothing to do with America. I'm going to write my State Department and have them tell me about it. Well, needless to say, I did. 6 months later, I got a reply, and the reply basically was a photograph of the Great Seal's front. The pyramid. They didn't say a thing about the pyramid in the eye and the triangle. They were just telling me about what I already knew and what everybody else knew about the eagle side and the arrows and the olive branches and everything. And so I got pretty disturbed, because this was the State Department. They were supposed to know. So I thought maybe they were shortchanging me, so I wrote back again. And this time, 3 months later, I received a black and white photograph of the pyramid in the eye and the triangle. That's all. No information. I then realized that they weren't going to tell me, because maybe they didn't know. Then I went to encyclopedias, and they didn't give me the kind of information I needed, and that's when I fell into the trap that we all fell in the late 60s. And that was, we didn't have an internet. Not that it would have been too much help at that time, but we didn't have an internet, so I went to all the most important sources I could find, and I found if you look at my bibliography, it contains scores and scores of these publications that were done in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And the problem with all those was that they didn't have the history of it. You have to have a foundation of what happened first, who did what, and you have to have that in order. Well, they didn't have that. The State Department didn't have it till 1978, and I know because I raised holy hell with them. Even in their own book, Eagle and the Shield, they mentioned my haranguing them and questioning certain things that made them probe deeper. And fortunately, that really made a difference, because they got to the bottom of it. But they could not answer me in 67, 68. When I was going to be doing record album covers for certain record companies of rock and roll, I was then introduced to, I guess you might call the top guys in rock and roll, because they thought that the information that I wanted to talk to these guys about, which was Atlantis, reincarnation, UFOs, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, dozens of fields that all of these guys, Hendrix, or the Doors, or Morrison, or Joplin, or Marley, all of these guys were into that. So when I went backstage with them, especially Hendrix, when I would bring in my sketchbooks, he pulled out his little drawings, and he was always drawing, he was always writing, and we kept looking at this symbol and said, what the heck does this mean? And I said, okay, all right, here's my references on this, Jimmy. It was Paul Foster Case, Manly Palmer Hall, Theodore Helene, scores of them. And I said, this is their conclusion. Their conclusion was that the Great Seal of the United States was designed by a group of Freemasons, of which 50 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. I accepted that. But there were no other sources except these scores and scores of sources that said so. Unfortunately, I was wrong. I spread disinformation here and there the same way. The internet, this is terrible to have to say this, but I did. I hadn't done my doctoral research. I hadn't gone to the primary sources, so what did I know? I thought I knew only because there were no other sources out there. But I became dependent on them, and all of us talked about this thing about who designed the Great Seal. Well, it had to be Freemasonry, because these are all Freemasonic symbols. Manly Palmer Hall says they were on the committee. They designed it. Okay. So then, finally, after years and years of this, I decided in 1975 I had to resolve this, which meant I had to pay the piper, which meant I had to go after my doctorate to get to the primary sources. Because I saw conflicts in what these people were saying. First of all, when you take a look at the history of the Great Seal, here is one of the major mistakes we all made, mainly because the State Department didn't have that publication out yet. And that was this. When you take a look at who designed the Great Seal of the United States, and especially when you talk about the pyramid and the triangle, because that's mostly what people wanted to know. The first thing we learned that really, well, messed my head up with this. The guys that designed it, none of them had any Freemasonic leanings, were not members of any secret society, but it ended up being a William Barton and a Charles Thompson. Now, William Barton, where most other researchers have made the mistake, especially the internet today, they see William Barton's name. Hey, they check on William Barton. Yes, they will find a William Barton in Delaware that was a Freemason, but that wasn't the William Barton we were talking about. That wasn't the man that put the pyramid on the back of the one of the Great Seal of the United States. These guys were religiously involved, deeply involved. Charles Thompson was the Secretary of Congress. He was brought up by Native Americans. He had a whole internal spiritual life, but he was a member of no secret society. And it was Thompson who basically gave us the eagle side with the arrows and the olive branch and that type of thing. But again, going back to this reverse of the Great Seal, what I began to find out, and this scared the living heck out of me, because you got to understand, any of us that have any ethical leanings and want to tell the truth, when we find out we've made one hell of a mistake that we've repeated to some very famous people over decades, then you know, one gets really embarrassed. I mean, you feel like, what am I going to do? How am I going to resolve this issue? That's why I had to find out then how did that happen? How did Manly Palmer Hall come to say, and I love Manly Palmer Hall. He and I corresponded for over 10, 12 years. I have his letters we fought like crazy over stuff.
Right.
But as a scholar, you know, there's nothing wrong with disagreeing with someone else. You present your point of view. They present their point of view. You go back and forth and you get to the bottom of it. Well, this was something that scared me more and more, because those who said it was Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams that created the pyramid and the Iron Triangle and our Great Seal are dead wrong. All of the ideas, all of Jefferson's ideas and Franklin's ideas and Adams' ideas were thrown out. It was the final third and last committee, and those guys had nothing to do with Freemasonry. Now, why Manly Palmer Hall made this very sad mistake that everybody quotes now. Everyone, because they say, Manly Palmer Hall, he's a Freemason, and therefore he must know what he's talking about. Well, Manly Palmer Hall started writing about Freemasonry in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and 50s. When did he become a Freemason? Somewhere in the late 50s. He didn't know what he was talking about. So as good a researcher as he was in certain areas, he wasn't prepared when he's talking about Freemasonry. When he wasn't a Freemason, he did not know what they were saying, really.
Okay.
So that arrogance, that was one of the reasons why he and I had lots of hassles. I said, how could you make a mistake like that? Well, of course, he didn't have Patterson and Dougal 1978, but he quit. Later on, he changed, as well as a number of other people in this particular area. So the very first thing that all of us taught that was basic, which if you go to the internet, was Freemasons designed the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States, and since they were Freemasons and these were symbols of the secret society, this is their perspective, then therefore our founding fathers, our country was founded by a group of secret society individuals who had some major object in mind, and that was the control of the country or the control of the planet.
Right.
Now, that may be in the minds of some of them, but I can tell you this, being a co-Mason and having studied Freemasonry for 40 or 50 years, there's no way that a small group like Freemasonry today could have that kind of power. nor does it desire that kind of power, because if you ever brought that up at the lodge meeting, you'd be expelled. You'd be thrown out. You're not allowed to talk about politics inside the lodge. And inside the lodge is where all the important stuff happens. So I began to realize, very sadly, somewhere as we moved towards the middle of the 70s, that I had made some major mistakes, as well as all of these other folks that I depended on. And it was mainly because I'd like to say to them, you know, I'm sorry that the State Department didn't have the correct information, right stuff out there. It didn't do it until 78. And that's how you can tell when you look at anyone's references. If they don't have Patterson and Dougal in it, there's a very good chance that they're going to totally miss the history, accurate history of what really happened. But that was only the first of the big problems that I had in regards to understanding this particular symbol and seal, because there were other statements, such as when you take a look at the symbols on the Great Seal, the eye and the triangle and the pyramid, then we find supposedly that these are Freemasonic symbols, that these are used by secret societies. Now, they have been popularized decades after the design of the Great Seal. And in truth, the reverse of the Great Seal, with its eye in the triangle, was the very first time, well, that symbol had been used, period. And the guy responsible was Charles Thompson. Now, I've seen eyes and triangles manufactured all over the place, especially when you go on the internet and they go back to the Bavarian Illuminati. And I've tried to find the source. There's only one source that I've seen that says, we've seen this eye in a triangle. It was in a British museum for a brief period of time, but now it's gotten lost and we can't find it anymore. So I really would have loved to have, because when I was involved in this in the mid-60s, I would have loved to have had that particular information to be able to prove it, but I couldn't, because that's what I was trying to do. You know, when you write a doctoral thesis, you try to disprove everything you say. You can't say it unless you've tried to disprove it. And if you can't disprove it, then you can come to your conclusions fairly. That's what anyone who does research knows that you got to do. You can't just say, hey, I got a great idea here, and I'm going to find my sources on this, and I'm going to be able to prove it that way. Well, that's ass backwards. And that's the reason why the quality of our research, especially in many different things, not just the Great Seal, leaves a great deal to be desired. So, but there came a great deal of confusion about the Great Seal of the United States, especially in 1935. In 1935, when it was placed on the dollar bill, you have a totally different aspect of this, because Freemasons definitely were involved. That is, FDR and Wallace.
Henry Wallace, yeah.
Henry Wallace especially, as well as Morgenthau. And, of course, Morgenthau and Wallace didn't get along at all, but that makes no difference. They were all Freemasons, and the actual guy who designed that 1935 dollar seal on the back of the dollar bill was also a Freemason. Indeed, you did have a conspiracy there, but it wasn't so much a conspiracy, it was a total misunderstanding, because FDR looked at this symbol and said, hey, look at this. This is from Masonic. This he was making, of course, this is the President of the United States. He's got authority, right? He said, hey, look at this symbol here, the eye in a triangle. This is all Masonic. And so therefore, you know, I think what we're going to do, let's take a look at that motto down there, Novus Ordo Seclorum. He translated that along the lines of the New Deal. That helped his campaign to become president and everything like that, saying, look, hey, look, we're right in line with the Great Seal of the United States. Of course, it's a total mistranslation. Anyone who has studied Latin, and I've used a number of Latin scholars to go over this, translates this as it's not the new order of the ages, but Novus Ordo Seclorum means the new order of the ages, which was a republic, a representative form of government, because our founding fathers like many other founding fathers around the planet, were deeply involved in what was called the Age of Enlightenment.
Right.
The Age of Enlightenment is the key here.
Yes.
And this is what not what the other researchers pay any attention to. You go you go up to the internet and you check all of the resources, all the things they say. They don't talk about the Age of Enlightenment. It was really key. And all of us know that the church, unfortunately, in the past, has done some pretty ugly things in regards to science and scientists. You know, Galileo looks through his telescope. He sees there's marks on the sun. Well, you know, that puts him in bad situation because the sun's supposed to be perfect. The Catholic Church said, okay, you do this, keep on talking about this, and you're going to be history. And they did this to Brahe. They did this to so many other scientists. But most people don't realize in this country that was a major problem in our being able to advance our knowledge in the world, especially in medicine and healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. There were individuals that did not realize that without that freedom, science would never be able to move against certain diseases or alter our consciousness about what really is physical and non-physical and what is spiritual and not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very complicated issue, as you can see. But when you get to the bottom of this, again, it all is based upon one's sources of research and accuracy over a period of time, and trying to disprove what you're saying is correct. And when you do that, then it's a totally different thing, because within the Age of Enlightenment, separation of church and state was key. We did not have separation of church and state in this country until Jefferson did it in Virginia. This is an extraordinary soul, Jefferson was. Yes, he was involved with an African-American slave. Yes, he had children by them. Yes, of course. Mm-hmm. Problem, of course, was, when his wife died, he made her a promise. And I would have never been able to make a promise like that. Never to marry again. Not to become involved. You have a guy that's at his height, and his physical abilities, etc., being literally signing an agreement not signing it, agreeing, okay, this is what I'm going to do. That's why he didn't marry again. And that's why he couldn't marry again or even become deeply involved with other women. And, of course, he took advantage of Sally Hemings, and then had a really good relationship. He loved her. There's no doubt about that. But he also knew the problems of that. He wasn't absolutely open and honest about that. That I understand. But the point is, the separation of church and state was absolutely key for Virginia becoming what Virginia is, and for the United States of America to become what it was, because most of our founding fathers were deists. Now, amongst the fundamentalists today, they look at this nation as a Christian nation. And they want everybody who's not Christian to get the hell out or just don't say anything. Get out of here. Mainly because supposedly they don't have the truth, and because they don't have the truth, and until they get the truth of Jesus is the only way, then they're not going to be considered as being worthy of even listening to. That's what America has devolved into now, with the fundamentalists becoming extremely powerful, especially after our last president. W. Bush really allowed them to come out of the woodwork. And it's very unfortunate, because I know I've spent time with his dad. I've spent time with, that is George Bush. I've spent time with his brother John Bush. I was very close to John Bush. Whether a person's a Republican or Democrat doesn't mean so much to me, except what they really believe is really key. And it doesn't mean I won't vote for. It doesn't make any difference as to me over a period of time whether I'll vote Democratic or Republican or independent. I'm free to do that. Our country allowed us to do that. But fundamentalists do not like that. They do want that to disappear. And it almost happened in that election in 1800 when you had Thomas Jefferson going up against the Illuminati up there in Boston at that particular time. That was one terrible, terrible, egregious mess. And that's why this book, The Bavarian Illuminati in America, which came out, 1912 and republished by Dover after that, lays it out as to how they were using two particular sources, which they found later on to be just filled with BS. And that was John Robinson's book and also Andrew Barruel. These two individuals, especially Barruel, they wanted to become Freemasons, and Robinson wanted to become Freemasons. He got dumped for all kinds of reasons, which not necessary to go into. I don't want to demean his character, but this guy wasn't everything we had hoped as far as an historian goes. And it was that revelation up there that what we had in Boston was the revival of, and this is 1798 to 1799 to 1800, was the revival of the idea that the Illuminati had made it in America. They're here to take us over, and we must stop them. And Thomas Jefferson is an Illuminati, therefore, do not vote for him. Needless to say, that we almost lost a republic, because they also believed that human beings could not rule themselves. This is what many fundamentalists don't understand, where their origins are. We cannot rule ourselves. We need a theocracy. We need a boss. We need somebody that's going to tell us what to believe and what to do. That's a far cry from what our founding fathers were attempting to establish, and that's why that particular election in 1800 was really the key to whether or not we really would become a republic. Because, again, if Jefferson had lost, then we would have had a king. That's what they were thinking. They wanted George Washington to become king. George Washington didn't want to become king, but they felt that his family should then, if he was king, his brothers, his sisters, and everybody else then becomes part of our government. Holy cow! That means we would have moved right back into where we came from, a monarchy, which is exactly what the fundamentalists wanted, because they wanted a Christian nation. Nobody else but Christians, and that they made it very clear that that's where they were headed. And fortunately, Jefferson, and I'm sure you're familiar with Jefferson's Bible, the founding fathers. And he didn't write this Bible for everyone to read. But what he didn't write it at all. All he did, as you know, it took him 16 years to take his Bible, and all he wanted to have in it was what Jesus said, what Jesus was talking about. He didn't want to hear about the interpretations and analysis of other individuals. So he clipped all of those little sayings all together, put them in a little book, and it was private. It was not to be published. The Library of Congress published it in the beginning of the 1900s. That's how we got it. It wasn't trying to put out any propaganda, but it was his way of saying, yes, I am a true believer in the philosophy and life of Jesus. He was not talking about the religious aspects of it. He was talking about the general philosophy of Jesus was pretty much paramount to many other great teachers. And therein is the conflict, because in fundamentalism, no other religion is as good as the Christian tradition. And the Christian tradition, of course, as they're concerned with, comes from the King James Bible. Now, the King James Bible didn't have any, when they put it together, they didn't have any of the ancient, they didn't have any of the Hebrew texts. They didn't have the most that they had at that particular time was the work of one of my ancestors by law, and that is Saint Jerome, Saint Hieronymus, in the Latin Vulgate Bible. That was their key, but they did not translate well the Bible. But I don't want to get deeply into that, but I mean, that's what the fundamentalists believe.
Right. There's so many things here I want to try to touch upon and cover here, obviously, and why don't we begin? Because I think that you bring up a good point in terms of the importance of the Enlightenment during this specific era when the United States is being formed, put together, documents are signed, seals are created, and all this is happening pretty much at the same time. We have the French Revolution going on, and then we have the American Revolution has been dubbed the sister revolution, obviously, as well. And we do have some interesting characters here. I mean, Benjamin Franklin is very interesting in itself, obviously. He's a member of the Nine Sisters Lodge that was established in Paris at the same time, 1776. Then we have the Order of the Illuminati coming together at that same year as well. So there's a lot of things happening in the world at that time and at that point. And it's obviously understandable that people from today are looking back to this period and seeing that a lot of this stuff is going on behind the scenes, so to speak. These orders are being formed, things are being put together, nations are being created, and so it's an understanding there that something is happening and something is going on. So the question is, do you think there could have been influences back and forth here? I mean, for instance, we have another guy coming on the scene who allegedly combined some of these things in terms of what has been dubbed the art from the medallic arts. It's a guy called Pierre-Eugène de Soumitière, who apparently is involved in creating this as well and putting the Eye of the Providence on the first Great Seal committee or designs that. What do you think about him and what do you make of that? Is he the primary guy behind this, do you think?
Well, he was being certainly a staunch believer in the Age of Enlightenment. In the Age of Enlightenment, they went all the way back to the Greece and Rome, mainly because of the brief republics that were experienced in both Greece and Rome. And that's one of the reasons why Jefferson and others who were studying to become architects all went back to Greece and Rome, because they felt that the very first republics, even though they were not forget about being exact, but they were similar to a representative form of government that did have some validity back in Greece and Rome. Now, de Soumitière suggested the eye, the single eye. He didn't put it in a triangle then, and that came to William Barton, Charles Thompson. But he knew he was a collector of all kinds of Americana. There are so many sad stories about some of these founding fathers, and Pierre has a story that just breaks your heart. He collected all these materials, all going almost bankrupt, and he literally wanted to have a museum, an American museum, on our symbols and everything. Well, it never really happened, mainly because of the economics and the lack of support that he could not find because of the revolution and after the revolution. There wasn't the kind of money to put this kind of stuff together, and besides, there were more serious problems than looking at symbols and images. So de Soumitière is a great unsung hero. But for him to suggest the single eye was natural, because that was God.
Right, exactly, because that was one of my points here as well. I mean, this is a symbol that is prominent in many of the churches around Europe, at least. I don't know how things are in the States in terms of that, or if there might be specific denominations within Christianity that carries this symbol. But here it's known as the Holy Trinity, basically, and you have a triangle, and then the eye inside. You have rays sometimes just coming out, and sometimes you can even see the sun rays forming a triangle almost coming out of the eye. So it depends on interpretation, obviously. But again, does that mean that to you then that this specifically actually is a Christian symbol? Is that the origins of that particular one?
No, it was not a Christian symbol, because Egypt. You can even find the single eye on certain stela, not just in Egypt, but in ancient Rome, etc. This is an old symbol, and it always meant the same thing. It always meant this is God, this is the supreme being. There are many different levels to that particular meaning of the symbol, and you're absolutely right. You know, on the page 40 in my book, you have a Christian. This was in Germany, yes, Western Germany. I cannot pronounce this cathedral, but we have a good illustration of the eye in the triangle for a church.
Yep.
it wasn't often. It was more often used in Europe than it was in America.
It's probably at the Aachen Cathedral. Could that be it? Aachen.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. The unfortunate thing is, at this particular time, I'm writing 3 books at this time, and so deeply immersed in all the other new research that my memory's not. This book was a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate to give you as a terrible, but that's the truth. I mean, I can't remember.
We can't have it all in our heads all the time. That's why we write books, right? So we can detail it and move on, as it were. Yeah.
You got that right. I mean, and yet because it's just all of this stuff kind of melds together. But back to Samitier, this was one of the great founding fathers, along with who was not recognized, was not given the kind of recognition, and certainly not the support that he needed. But we had others that were very similar. Francis Hopkinson, who literally gave us the pyramid. He put the pyramid on the back of a $50 bill in 1778. Before his was the original voice of putting a pyramid on any dollar bill anywhere.
And that was colonial money, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
It was a $50 bill with an unfinished pyramid with a little doorway in the bottom, and it literally was, as we found out in further research, that it was taken from the Great Pyramid of Giza. That's what he was talking about. But it was a stepped pyramid as well, and that's because, of course, if you look at the Great Pyramid today, it's stepped only because well, not everyone, but much of all of the limestone facing has been removed, making it a stepped pyramid by and large. But you can't see that until you're close up. But that's what he was referring to, the Great Pyramid of Egypt, Giza, that is. And that pyramid to them, as to many other secret societies, refers to that as a kind of a temple. They didn't just think of it as a tomb. There were multiple levels of meaning to a pyramid, and it's especially as a temple, and as a place of initiation. And that's one of the reasons why it's important that the coffer was there. Freemasons, I'm a co-Mason, and I'm also a Rosicrucian, and the rituals that we perform indeed are related to those things in the 3rd degree. Mm-hmm. So it's important to look at not just that's Du Samitier, but when you look at the Charles Thompson, this fella, who was inducted, literally lived with a tribe of Native Americans, and because of that, he was given the name "He who speaks with man who speaks the truth." Mm-hmm. He was the Secretary of Congress for over 16 years. He knew more secrets about how things were put together than anybody else, and he was very closed-mouthed about everything. That did not make him a member of any secret society. He wanted to see this nation persevere. He knew it had enemies from within all over the place. I mean, especially when you go up to about the year of 1800, in that particular election that I referred to before, there was a great many people there that said, no, we're not going to go the way of a republic. We're going to go the way of a monarchy again. I mean, most Americans have no idea that was it. I can't overstress that, because we almost had the same thing in our country with the last W administration, in which they started bringing up all this stuff about the Illuminati and dumping it on anyone who really talked about separation of church and state, because that's the key to any republic. You must have that, or you don't have freedom of your spiritual beliefs, which I think are more important than just your physical belief. That's my bias. I'm biased along those lines.
There's so many things that we can talk about in terms of the symbols and how it was put together. I mean, I've even heard, maybe we can touch briefly on this as well, that if you actually measure the angle of the pyramid that is depicted within the dollar bill, it's actually more closely related to what is known as the Pyramid of Cestius, that actually is positioned in Rome, than the Pyramid of Giza, because of the angle of the pyramid itself. So it could be argued that it might not even be the specifics of the Giza pyramid, but other pyramids around the world which have the same angle. The question, of course, is how detailed do you think they were when they were making the design? Is it more like, okay, let's have a pyramid on here, but
yes,
let's not measure the angles, or let's not do anything else in terms of that? What do you think, Robert?
Well, I published a book in 1976 that mentioned this particular theory, and I must say that I'm part of this problem here. It was then. I measured the angles, etc. But then I found out, much to my I wish I just had spent a lot more time in the Library of Congress, but in many of the actual designs that we had for not just our money, but on Statue of Liberty and all of our other particular components and symbols, many of them were pyramids of all kinds of angles. I mean, steep pyramids that almost looked like an obelisk to flat. But what was the pyramid? That's the key here. It's not its measurements, because certainly but William Barton didn't measure any of that. There's no discussion about that at all in his papers and that kind of thing. And he wasn't hiding anything, because he wasn't any member of any secret society. So the pyramid, to them, that angle was not important. I thought it might be. But, that's speculation on my part. And it's great to speculate, but I think you got to have your feet down in the actual accuracy in an historical development of things. But to the Native American, not the Native Americans, because that's another thing altogether, but to our founding fathers, what was the pyramid? They told us it was a symbol for strength and duration. It meant that we were establishing a nation that would last throughout the centuries. And they always wanted to tie it to everything that was Greek, Roman. That's one of the reasons why we have, as we go to Washington, D.C., I couldn't believe it when I was growing up. I thought it was in Greece or Rome. I was somewhere else.
Well, the architecture is straight out of that world. It's Roman, Greek, a Palladian architecture, all of it there.
Correct. And of course, that's because in the Age of Enlightenment, especially when temples, buildings were built, cities were laid out, they were laid out into certain patterns, and they were laid out in those patterns to, as David Oveson would say, to direct and funnel and channel positive energies into those locations. Now, it's mighty complicated, but the same thing, that's exactly what Freemasonry does, or any architect did in the past, because in Greece and Rome, the key thing dealt with those particular angles. And of course, then we're coming up to the golden mean, or there's so many ways of talking about that, but the palladium is extremely important, because it's so subtle, as you know. It's so subtle. The way the columns rise as they move inward, and it's like the Great Pyramid. It wasn't flat. It was concave, so subtly done on all four sides that mostly you wouldn't notice it.
Yeah,
that's an extraordinary technological achievement. I don't know if we could do it today. It would be mighty hard. But most people are not aware of that, and it was created in that way so that it would receive energy and send at the same time. Now, this is speculation, right? I understand that. But at the same time, knowing enough about symbols, archetypes, and their relationship to consciousness, the important work of Joseph Campbell and Rollo May and Abraham Maslow, and you name them. I mean, there's of them, Carl Jung especially, gives us a totally internal view as to the importance of these things, rather than it's just a monument. It wasn't. To them, the pyramid was a suggestion that we are tied into the ancients, we are part of them, we are an extension of them, we are carrying out their ideas and ideals, especially in Greece and Rome, because it was separation of church and state was key to everything that we did within this particular country. But today, there is a great many challenges by the fundamentalists who say, no, we should not. We should not separate church and state, because this is a Christian nation, and their view is, hey, let's take a look at Let's take a look at the population of most Americans during that time. Yes, they were mostly Christian. That's true. But we didn't build our country on that. That's not what our founding fathers had decided.
So do you think that could be one of the problems, one of the misconceptions in terms of when discussing the roots and origins of the United States as well, that the architects and those who put things together, those who planned the nation, and in many cases also built the cities, they went back to the ancient world for inspiration, and in one way, do you think that means that they're bypassing, if you will, Christianity then, if they go to the quote-unquote pagan world instead of going to Christian sources for reference and for inspiration? What do you think about that, Robert?
Well, what I think is, by and large, that they wanted there to be a mixture of all different cultures that were saying the same thing. Now, I'm going to say something that's going to sound kind of corny to you, but I think our founding fathers, having studied them relatively closely, especially Jefferson made some statements that were just extraordinary in regards to what he saw as the future of America. And by and large, we are moving towards, as we move towards representative forms of government, we are moving towards an ideal that we are one people on one planet. Now, I realize how naive that sounds, but I also believe that that's exactly where we eventually are headed. And the most important thing about this nation is that it was able to found a successful representative form of government, and that in turn gave, well, a fertile ground for the rest of the planet to establish other representative forms of government without a monarch, with separation of church and state, etc. Of course, all this is Age of Enlightenment. It's old. I mean, it's Jefferson when he developed or designed his own home, Monticello. Whoa, you talk about interesting symbolism and power found in his work. He was very conscious of this, that aspect of it.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Do you want to finish that point there?
Well, I can't overemphasize his importance, because he had to hide many of those things that he believed in. And so therefore, when he discusses, say, for instance, his layout for the University of Virginia, he has to be very careful. I found references that refer to the ancient Kabbalah and using certain patterns within the University of Virginia and other buildings that he created. And he had to steer clear of all of that controversy. As a matter of fact, most people wouldn't understand that today, because if you show them the layout of University of Virginia, they couldn't see any Kabbalistic significance because they haven't been trained to. But he knew of those things, and he knew of the types of energies those shapes and forms would have, especially in regards to what he and others would later on come to accept as the world is moving towards a science of the spiritual world. We are moving towards our being able to prove, say, for instance, this is kind of base in some ways, we know that people exist now beyond the physical body. The work, especially now that I've seen, we've been covering this in some of our shows more recently, the science now of energy fields, our cameras and other technology are revealing things that we had never seen before. And I'm talking about the last 4 or 5 years, and which we are going to prove of the existence of not just us after we die, but the fact is that we are surrounded by other living beings of all types. I'm not necessarily talking about extraterrestrials. There indeed might be that, but that our world is not just a human consciousness world. There are other beings that have lived here forever. And I think it's going to be one of the big shocks to most Americans who seem to still think that the physical body is all there is, and when you pass on, then it's over. The most important work, especially I think of an area of Dr. Ian Stevenson and reincarnation, which has now been picked up by others at University of Virginia and taken even further. People are going to see that maybe some of them were here before. But most importantly, in the sciences of healing, we are beginning to see the importance of locations are important as to where you build things.
Right.
And if you build things over underground streams, if you build them in certain areas the energy field which is somewhat distorted, you're going to have some pretty sick people. This kind of work is really important by some of my dear friends who are now dead. This is a sad thing about being 66. My closest friend, you may have heard of him, his name was Christopher Bird. Christopher Bird wrote The Secret Life of Plants, The Secret Lives of Dowsing, and Secrets of the Soil, in which we finally find out that one of the reasons why our nutrition is so bad in this country is the total loss of our topsoil and all the little creatures and beings that are in the topsoil that make it allow it to become so abundant with the vitamins and minerals that it's supposed to have. Today, if you have a good old ear of corn, you're going to have to, in the old days, in the 30s and the 40s, that ear of corn could have been sufficient enough to give you a certain amount of vitamins and minerals. But today, you'd have to eat 5 or 6 of them.
Sure, the topsoil layer is depleted. I mean, that's why we have to put in all the phosphor and all the other things there to kind of give it a boost, as it were, as well. That's very worrying, actually, in one way, yeah. You
know something? I am so impressed by you. No offense, but your knowledge of so many different fields in comparison to any other interview I do anywhere, I thank you.
All right, thank you for that. I feel like we haven't even gotten started yet. There's so many things I want to ask you here.
Well, yeah, I know. I'm sorry, but
it's
you know,
all right.
You have to understand. You have to understand that I'm always going to battle on certain types of fundamentalists who basically say our founding fathers were Satanists.
Sure. Yeah.
Our founding fathers were not Satanists, and the evidence that they pull together that they are is pathetic. And it is so pathetic that's the reason why I took certain parts of my book to point out just how pathetic it was. And I didn't want to waste the paper and the time doing it, but I thought people needed to understand where did they get their information. Well, if they're getting it from each other and they're all making the same mistakes, it doesn't go anywhere. So why in the world buy a $24.95 book who's repeating all the same errors that the other guys made? Well, that doesn't seem reasonable to me, especially when the economy is the way it is. But that's another.
That's a very good point, because that kind of leads into one aspect that I want to touch upon here as well. And I guess the overarching question, I'm going to preface this a little bit more here, but that has to do with what you consider to be the threats of America today, and if you believe that there has been a battle going on in terms of behind the scenes. Because, again, if the United States was designed on this positive note, you even talked about city layout in terms of channeling positive energy, into Washington, D.C., for instance, and but on the same time, on the other side of that coin, then it could be argued also that America has become incredibly corrupt today in terms of the economic situation, and things are generally falling apart, it seems like. So what has happened there? If the intention was so good, and if the founding fathers had this idea, what do you think went? I know this is a huge question, but what do you think went wrong there? Is it something wrong with their intention, or has someone hijacked the project, if you will, and taken it over? What do you think?
It's those things, but most importantly, greed grows exponentially if you think that all there is the physical world. That there is nothing, when your consciousness passes on, that's it. It wraps it up. You got a lot of toys, you win. We have been mired in science as a religion for decades. I don't know how many, maybe 6, 7, that has totally pushed spirit out. And the only kind of spiritual, one of the only kinds of spiritual appreciation comes with the fundamentalists, who are absolutely opposed to science. So you have it becomes complicated, because the fundamentalists don't want to hear about the possibility. There are problems with evolution. There are. But they're not like we're being told. The emphasis is being placed on there's no such, the certain aspects of it. But they certainly, when they put the textbooks together on Darwinianism, and as you know, Darwin later on repudiated something, but of course they always say, well, he was an old man then, what the hell did he know? So you can forget about the problems that he found in it. But and and you have the same kind of problem in peer reviewing. If you establish a university of writers that write have to go through a peer review, their work is reviewed so strongly that needless to say, if your ideas aren't along the lines of theirs, it's not going to get published. We've had some serious problems with that. And going back to this whole thing with science, like the alternative energies in the form of what used to be called cold fusion. You remember that aspect of the late 80s and 90s when finally science poo-pooed it, put it down, said, we can't read it. Now over 200, more than that now, laboratories around the planet, especially the Japanese and others, they have moved ahead of it. They don't call it cold fusion anymore. I think it's low LCR. Wait, I dismissed my mind. No, L and C, low nuclear reactions. No, there's something like that. Wait. Low energy nuclear reactions. Yeah, it's LENR. They don't use the term cold fusion anymore. But they have made major advances along these lines. Now, unfortunately, the scientists at I'm sitting here in Maryland. This is the bastion of Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins University carries a lot of weight. But also, at the same time, the entire philosophy of that university is based upon the physical world is all there is kind of thing. So this idea of we got problems in the sense that are the greed that unfortunately thinking that the physical world is all there is. I mean, let's face it. If you learned, if you were didn't believe in anything else but the physical world. I'm not talking about being an atheist or anything like that. I'm just talking about if the physical world was all there is, and it was a big announcement, hey, that comet that's coming towards us, it's it. 2 weeks, it's over here. What would happen? With those people, it would only be normal for them to go out there and steal cars or do anything they wanted, because there ain't nothing else. It's not like the atheists that I have good friends with, or I'm good friends with, who have a whole thing, whole series of ethics that they believe in, which does not, as far as they're concerned, does not align them with the forces of the physical world is all there is. So I'm going to do what I want. Okay? So from this perspective, the only religion in this country that the fundamentalists want, and this is a growing group, really has nothing to do with science. They're against the whole idea of the global warming. Of course, global warming has been misnamed because of the records and stuff that I received and worked with, because I had a lot of good friends back in the old days with the CIA and the OSS, and they would feed us information all the time on the weather patterns. And the conclusion of the CIA in the mid-'70s was, yes, we're going to have big weather changes, but it's not just going to be all hot. Some parts of our planet's going to be are going to become colder, and of course we've got some. This will mean that our growing seasons are going to change greatly. We're in for deep doo-doo. I mean, I remember reading that stuff in '75 and realized, hey, this is the CIA saying this. This isn't any prophet or anything. But all that just to say that the views of these fundamentalists, especially the fundamentalist Christians, because there are fundamentalist Muslims, there are fundamentalist Jews, etc. But amongst this particular group this is a Christian nation, Everything that you need to know is in the Bible, the King James Bible, and we don't need any of this other stuff. And that's you're beginning to hear things like, well, maybe we should just burn certain books again. I mean, that kind of thing in this country to keep this information from the people that are members of that particular parish. So our country swallowed a bad bill of goods. It's confluenced the movers and the shakers, and of course those are in the colleges and the universities and also in the religious institutions. The science of spirit has not taken hold yet, and will not for a little while longer, as more of these things become confirmed. So I believe that's one of the reasons why we have literally fallen off the rail in regards to what we were.
Okay.
We are no longer what we were, and I do believe that's one of the reasons why other nations on this planet will probably surpass this nation in many different ways, and then I think American people will grow up. You know, we're not supposed to rule the world. We're not supposed to be its police. We're not supposed to lay down the foundation for, America all over the place. We were here to establish a republic, and so that others could establish republics. We stole the idea of republics from the Native Americans. The League of the Iroquois had a republic at least as far back as 1400. A.D., maybe 1100 A.D. And when our founding fathers came to America and they discovered the League of the Iroquois, and they brought the League of the Iroquois into the chambers in which the founding fathers were lectured to. They were lectured to by these Native Americans. There is agreement with that. And if you have a copy of my book, then you know that literally Franklin, Jefferson, Thompson, you name any of the founding fathers, and they were especially indebted, and they said so, to the Native Americans. Now, we have individuals in the media in this country who absolutely hate the Indians, Native Americans. They do. Rush Limbaugh is one of them. He'll tell you, if you said, well, the Native Americans had a republic, he'll say, BS. That's crazy. What do they do? They couldn't, and he said, they didn't. I don't see them inventing televisions. I don't see them inventing cars. I don't see them living, etc.
Because that's what it's all about.
Exactly. The physical world is all about. They didn't give us any of that, and what they gave us was very little. He's wrong. He's wrong. The founding fathers, when they listened to the Native Americans and the League of the Iroquois and their chiefs told them, they warned them. They said, look, two things. If you do not do two things, your country is going to go through hell. Number one, you can't have slavery. That's totally not just acceptable, but it's one of the worst things you can do to another human being. That's against the higher laws. Slavery is out. Then they said, women are equal. Women should have a vote. Well, you see, in the Native American tradition, and the Cherokee and the League of the Iroquois, women were literally those who voted the chiefs in, and they could vote the chiefs out. Women owned all the property. They came to this conclusion because they realized that in order to stop the wars that the League of the Iroquois were having, they were destroying themselves. With one group of Native Americans, Onondaga against the Seneca, and the Seneca against other groups that were coming, Tuscarora, etc. They realized that the only way to stop this is to have women in charge, because they give birth. They do not want to see their children die. They will do everything they possibly can to prevent the death of their children. Therefore, it seemed reasonable to them, with their logical intuition, that women should be in charge. Now, I don't know if you should make women in charge of everything. That's not the point. The point here is that they weren't even given equality. Those 2 points that we missed, that the League of the Iroquois warned us against, that would be our undoing, are basically the kinds of things America is still struggling with today.
If you and again, then what happened there in terms of I remember a couple of news stories a while back talking about the fact that slaves helped to build the White House. So again, does that mean that the foundations of the American system is based on these of breaking those rules fundamentally? Do you think?
Well, I hate to use the term karma, but I'm gonna, because I know you know what that is all about. You do something to somebody, and then it's got to return to you. It's the law. Mm-hmm. We looked at it. They're building the White Houses because there was no money to create all of these things. That does not make an excuse for keeping them as slaves.
Sure.
I mean, again, part of it had to do with the economics of whether or not
of that particular time. That was the way you did things. Is that what you're saying, or? That's
right, but that doesn't make it right.
Sure, of course not.
You know, the thing is that obviously it should have been. We're hearing more and more from Hollywood about the, let's do something about the Native Americans and their relationship to the Founding Fathers, because I think that's going to be the key to our America beginning to grow up again and get out of its adolescence in regards to we Christians are running things. We were supposed to. You guys got in the way. Science got in the way. Let's eliminate science. I mean, it's the same kind of tradition which if you would listen to those that are involved in fundamentalism, would scare you to pieces.
Sure, sure.
And that means to me that obviously, as far as I'm concerned, and this is an unpopular thing to say, is something that obviously those who have the knowledge should be speaking out against it and re-educating our people. But the media in America, you have to, who owns our media?
We're a few companies, as far as I've heard, at least. I don't know specifically. People even mentioned Rothschilds owning certain things of AP and Reuters and things like that. Don't know if that's true, though, but that's what I hear.
Well, in America, in 1986, then President Ronald Reagan allowed his employer, which was General Electric, to buy NBC. That was the beginning.
Right.
With General Electric, one of the greatest polluters on the planet, with consciousness had no conscience whatsoever about what they were doing to people, almost like Union Carbide in India. I mean, those stories are just unbelievable. But, that the relationship between General Electric and its ownership of nuclear power plants and other energy systems, you were not going to get any straight talk about news in regards to problems of nuclear energy and problems with overhead power lines and problems of dealing literally with other types of energies that are created as we move through this process of even take a jet plane dumping its contents repeatedly over certain areas of land, which they do here. And when they come in, they dump that poisonous propellant in certain areas. They're allowed to do it. Over a period of time, everything becomes polluted. And since General Electric owning NBC, all of that information is not discussed. Well, that's just one. That is just one
little aspect of all this, of course. And now we have the whole BP oil spill situation. And let's not even get into that yet. Robert, what I'd like to do here right now, though, is round things up here for the first hour and then continue talking more with you, obviously, because I want to try to get back on track in terms of some of the symbols as well, in terms of the foundation of America, and get back to some of these things that we haven't had time to discuss yet. The Phrygian cap, the Liberty cap, the obelisk, Washington Monument, some of the quotes even from George Washington himself, allegedly, in terms of the Illuminati and what you think about some of those quotes. But why don't we just mention, obviously, your website's out there, and also I want you to give us your book title so people are interested in reading some of this material that you've talked about and presented for us here today. How they would go about getting copies of those books, Robert?
Well, the book that I've been mostly quoting from today is the more recent one, 2008, The United Symbolism of America, Deciphering Hidden Meanings in America's Most Familiar Art, Architecture, and Logos. And it's published by New Page Books. And as a matter of fact, you can go to our website, www.21stcenturyradio.com. But the 21st is a numerical 21ST, 21stcenturyradio.com, and it can be ordered from there. Then the book that came before that, which put great deal more emphasis on the League of the Iroquois, etc., was Founding Fathers and Secret Societies. And obviously, if we're... Oh, that book, by the way, is published in Russian, German, French, Spanish, Japanese, etc., because the rest of the world seemed to think that this was an important symbol, that pyramid in the eye and the triangle. I mean, it's been amazing how quiet it has been since the mid-'60s till right now. But the Internet is in part responsible for that.
Absolutely. So specifically on Founding Fathers, Secret Societies, you can check out secretdestiny.org. Then we have the other website, unitedsymbolismofamerica.com. That's your latest book then, right? And then we have obviously your radio show and all the other material as well on 21stcenturyradio.com as well.
Right.
So, go ahead.
UnitedSymbolismofAmerica.com is really the key. This is a book that certainly has disturbed the fundamentalists a great deal, because what I did was confront them directly. I didn't mince words with these guys, because I think that they've literally taken over anyone who studies this area. They go to them first, not knowing exactly what their intent is. Their intent literally is, let's reestablish a Christian nation and get these other traveling and spending time with rock and rollers at that time. All of them, nobody was not interested in the pyramid and the eye and the triangle. Every one of them wanted to know what that meant. And of course, there was not solid information then, because it was until 1978 that the State Department came out with the book that really spelled out its history, that we have solid information. Of course, they had access to all the letters, all the things that you and I couldn't get hold of. And of course, that may be, to most people, that's who cares about that? But that's when you want to get to the truth, you got to go to primary sources. And it's costly. Yes, indeed. I did not appreciate having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get my education, but you gotta. If you really love the truth, and if you really especially want to understand who in the hell these amazing guys were, because to establish a foundation for a republic was not going to be easy. And of course, we have not told the whole story in regards to the League of the Iroquois Indians and the Cherokee Indians who influenced our founding fathers. That's the next big thing that's going to come up, because when we get contacts from Hollywood and elsewhere, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for another handle of a so-called something that's brand new. This isn't brand new. It's so old. But they have, again, Hollywood does they make money, and they entertain. That doesn't mean they're factual. And so when we take a look at National Treasure, I love the stories, but if you think they're history, then you've fallen into a ditch there. And they don't even pretend to be. I mean, any attempt to demolish someone who is opposing the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, let's put it that way, separation of church and state. These guys, want the church. They want this to be a Christian nation. They do not give a goddamn whether or not what they're doing is unethical, immoral, lies. It doesn't matter, because as far as they're concerned, anything to bring this downfall of this particular candidate. But this has happened before. It happened to Jefferson in 1798 to 1800. When he had to literally, there was a part of our country that were fundamentalists up in Boston. They wanted to take over. That's the ones that started. It was a great book that came out called The Bavarian Illuminati in America, Vernon Stauffer, that really clarified the issue. He went to primary sources and was able to track down where these rumors started. But unfortunately, books are not read in this country anymore. Mostly what we have is speculation on other people's speculations. And it's easy to do that way because, if you want to be an automatic, real quick highfalutin big seller. All you got to do is be controversial in this country. You know, we're a bit immature in lots of ways, and I'm not trying to bring our country down. It's not it. But the truth is that all you have to do is study a person's bibliography, know where they've got their information, and you have a decent handle, not a total handle, but you have a decent handle as to the quality of mind and research be done, because we all want the truth, and I used to believe what they believed. Back in 68, 67, 68, when I was... Dan Brown makes it clear that some of his stuff is right on, but, you know, he elaborates a great deal on it, and it makes it far more interesting. And if he didn't, they wouldn't have done his film. Yep,
that's right. There's another level of this sensationalism, and they're playing on that. And again, unfortunately, people do get programmed by that too, and pick up on that as it is the truth or whatnot. But Robert, before we proceed here and go too deep into it so far, I want to ask you just slightly a little bit here about your background. You obviously have a background in art. You've done some wonderful murals that I've been looking at as well. Some really cool stuff. I've always been enjoying murals. So much context in there to pick up on, obviously. But how long have you been studying symbolism, and specifically the connection with symbolism and the secret origins of America, Robert?
Well, what happened was about in 1963, I had a course in psychology, as we all do in undergraduate school, and the Dr. Carl Moser, he saw my interest in symbols and images and archetypes, and he said to me, "Look, you know, you really want to know this stuff, Bob? Get the book called Dictionary of Symbols by Serlo." And that started a whole different aspect to my life, because the reason why I got involved in American symbolism was being an artist where we were always poor. I mean, you know, you didn't have a phone. Certainly you didn't have a car. You didn't have a TV. You know, you had your studio and you ate. And that was about as much as you could in this country, because the arts weren't appreciated very much. That was really key. So the only way to cool off in my little 150-degree apartment was to sit in the cold water in the bathtub, and that's when I was looking at my last dollar bill and saw this pyramid in the eye and a triangle, and I thought to myself, what the hell is this? This has nothing to do with America. I'm going to write my State Department and have them tell me about it. Well, needless to say, I did. 6 months later, I got a reply, and the reply basically was a photograph of the Great Seal's front. The pyramid. They didn't say a thing about the pyramid in the eye and the triangle. They were just telling me about what I already knew and what everybody else knew about the eagle side and the arrows and the olive branches and everything. And so I got pretty disturbed, because this was the State Department. They were supposed to know. So I thought maybe they were shortchanging me, so I wrote back again. And this time, 3 months later, I received a black and white photograph of the pyramid in the eye and the triangle. That's all. No information. I then realized that they weren't going to tell me, because maybe they didn't know. Then I went to encyclopedias, and they didn't give me the kind of information I needed, and that's when I fell into the trap that we all fell in the late 60s. And that was, we didn't have an internet. Not that it would have been too much help at that time, but we didn't have an internet, so I went to all the most important sources I could find, and I found if you look at my bibliography, it contains scores and scores of these publications that were done in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And the problem with all those was that they didn't have the history of it. You have to have a foundation of what happened first, who did what, and you have to have that in order. Well, they didn't have that. The State Department didn't have it till 1978, and I know because I raised holy hell with them. Even in their own book, Eagle and the Shield, they mentioned my haranguing them and questioning certain things that made them probe deeper. And fortunately, that really made a difference, because they got to the bottom of it. But they could not answer me in 67, 68. When I was going to be doing record album covers for certain record companies of rock and roll, I was then introduced to, I guess you might call the top guys in rock and roll, because they thought that the information that I wanted to talk to these guys about, which was Atlantis, reincarnation, UFOs, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, dozens of fields that all of these guys, Hendrix, or the Doors, or Morrison, or Joplin, or Marley, all of these guys were into that. So when I went backstage with them, especially Hendrix, when I would bring in my sketchbooks, he pulled out his little drawings, and he was always drawing, he was always writing, and we kept looking at this symbol and said, you know, what the heck does this mean? And I said, okay, all right, here's my references on this, Jimmy. It was Paul Foster Case, Manly Palmer Hall, Theodore Helene, scores of them. And I said, this is their conclusion. Their conclusion was that the Great Seal of the United States was designed by a group of Freemasons, of which 50 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. I accepted that. But there were no other sources